Okay, I think we're going to get started in a little bit. I'm going to wait for Andrew from the control booth to give me a thumbs up that we're recording. I think we're good. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name's Cory Edwards. I'm on staff at the city's Office of Historic Preservation. I know some of you, but I see a lot of new faces, which is great. For this new initiative, we wanted to make sure that people had access to information and everything about our department and the work we do. And so I'm glad a lot of you came out. Make sure if you haven't sign in at the sign-in sheets, we will have a door prize later. So we'll just pick a random number and we will pick a winner. We'll have to pick two numbers. We'll have to pick 1 through 3, and then we'll have to pick, because we have 3 sign-in sheets, but Landry's on it. So OHP staff, thank you for being here. So we have Edward Hall, Landry Stafford, Megan Lozano in the back. Charles Gentry was in the hallway greeting you as you came in. So if you haven't had a chance to meet any of us, this is a great opportunity to kind of get to know staff. We actually staffed ourselves today because we have 2 competing events. So we have a few people also at the East Side Cemeteries with our Cemetery Stewards program. So welcome to Preservation Academy. How many have you been to our historic homeowner fair or home repair fair in the past? Okay, so if you've been going for years, you know we used to have educational sessions at that event. And really what we found is it's too much in one day. And so we didn't have enough time to kind of dig deep into some of those topics that you were interested in. We would get a lot of questions after the sessions were over, and we didn't have time to answer them all. And so this new series is really kind of a companion to the home repair fair that happens once a year, but this will be an ongoing series where we will bring topics for discussion and just educational purpose for you all. We get a lot of questions all the time, and so the topics will be based on the kinds of questions that we're routinely getting from our customers and residents. But if you have anything else that you want to know, so if you have a new historic home or you have a project you want to do, we're looking at things like bringing in experts on financing your rehab, insurance as questions that we get a lot. And so any specific topic that you want us to do a deep dive on, we're happy to do that and bring in experts. Foundation repair, of course. And so home repair fair is also a good resource for that. We have contractors there, but yeah, we'll bring in experts. Some of these will also be, so this one's recorded, it's a classroom session. We'll also have virtual opportunities, so it'll be easy to get to. All of these will be recorded and on OHP's website, so if you can't make it, you'll be able to catch that recording. But in person's always more fun, in my opinion. I don't like to sit in front of a computer for an hour watching a recording, so I'm probably going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions. At any time, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. We have a microphone that we're going to pass. My only concern is getting the question on the recording, because we are recording these, and so just make sure you wait for that microphone to come to you. It'll light up green, and then you'll know it's working. So the point of this series is to really understand the whys and hows of preservation, why we do this, where it all came from. We want to equip and empower you all with the resources and tools that you need to be good stewards of your historic properties if you own historic property, or a good advocate for preservation policy here in San Antonio. Technical assistance and trainings where appropriate. Again, we'll bring in experts for things like foundation repair and those kind of technical issues. We have a lot of like wood window repair workshops, and those experts come in, but there's more to an old building than the windows, so we understand that. And then really build a community of support. I know some of you are already sharing pictures of your homes and talking about your experiences, and so it is good to have those shared experiences that you can all compare notes with and resources with, and so it is also about getting to know each other as well. So if you haven't seen the website, so SA Speak Up is where all of the upcoming sessions will be posted. There's a QR code in the hallway that you can scan to see those. So these are just the ones we have on the calendar. We're going to keep going and adding these throughout the year and cover a variety of topics. So the next one is really about historic architecture in San Antonio and our historic districts and different styles that are common here. That'll be led by Amy Fulkerson, who's one of our staff members, and that one will be virtual on October 7th. And then people really also gravitate to our landscaping discussions, and so we will have a park staff member teaching about native and local plants that you can use to grow a pollinator garden. That'll be November 1st. And then in the new year, we'll be kicking it off with financing your rehab, and I think we'll have a guest speaker from a local bank that will talk to you about some of the options that you have. Okay, so this one is Historic Preservation 101. So we're not going to get into the weeds so much about the actual rules or review process itself. We're going to talk really high level about some of the federal and state level enabling statutes that make what we do here possible, and then a little bit about the department and an overview about the work that we do. Learning objectives today, we're going to talk about why preserve, why it's good practice, and why it's important for San Antonio in a policy perspective to preserve. Historic preservation at all levels of government, not just here in San Antonio, but at the state and federal levels as well. What are some of the best policies and practices? A little bit about our program, again, at the Office of Historic Preservation. That's the department that we all work for. We administer San Antonio's local preservation programs. And then looking forward, what does preservation look like? How is it changing? How is it evolving to meet 21st century demands? Ricky was nodding. I can tell she's chomping at the bit. Why preserve? There's a lot of reasons. I think most people understand that preservation contributes to the quality and character of our city, but it's really just a practical approach to the way that we do development and the way that we look at our existing buildings as resources. So preservation is sustainable. There's cultural continuity, again, like it kind of maintains that character and authenticity of the city. It's also a good catalyst for economic growth. We know that preservation projects require more hands-on jobs than new construction and those specialized trades, and so there is growth in the job sector from preservation projects. And then climate action. So if you're concerned about what we're doing with our buildings and its impact on the environment, then building reuse in general and historic preservation as a form of building reuse is an important component to that. So a little bit more, again, sense of place, connection to the past with cultural continuity. We have studied this in the past. We did an economic impact study in 2015 looking at the way that our historic neighborhoods meet our SA Tomorrow goals in terms of walkability and quality of life issues in San Antonio, access to transit and education systems and libraries and things like that. And really what it found is that our historic neighborhoods, I'm sorry about that sound, I don't know what that is, maybe it'll go away. Our historic neighborhoods are a really good model for smart growth in the city. And so, we don't really build neighborhoods the way that we used to in terms of infrastructure and the way the roads are mapped out. And urban sprawl is also something that is a concern to a lot of people that look at the sustainability of the city as a whole. And so really, if we look at our old neighborhoods, they're a good model for that. And then an opportunity to better understand and interpret our history. So if you're a history nerd and you like to read about our local history or state history, that's one thing, but it's another thing when you can actually see it and visit it and go inside some of these places where history happened. So it is an opportunity to enhance opportunities for that. Economic growth, again, I mentioned it creates more jobs in new construction, especially in the skilled trades. And so urban revitalization and housing opportunities. We know that there's a lot of discussions and investment in affordable housing here in San Antonio. And we know that that's an issue that we're not going to be able to build our way out of. New construction is more expensive than ever. And so looking at existing buildings and existing housing and preserving existing housing is a very important part of that solution for the city. Heritage tourism, San Antonio has over $14 billion economy, local tourism economy. A lot of that obviously is our convention center and the Alamo and the Riverwalk and things like that. But the overall kind of feel and sense of place of our downtown and the historic spaces contribute to that. And so it's, it's places that people want to be. And so we always laugh about every realtor listing between Tobin Hill and River Road says 5 minutes from Pearl. Well, part of the Pearl success and part of their ethos and the way that they developed that project is putting preservation in the middle. And so it creates a really unique place that people gravitate toward, and they pick restaurants there because they want to go to a cool place, and historic preservation is part of that. Climate action. So when you build a new building, you are harvesting new materials, you're manufacturing materials, you're shipping them across the globe a lot of times. And so all of those materials that go into construction have embodied carbon. And so when you look at an existing building, it's really an opportunity to rely less on new materials and to leverage that embodied carbon on a more sustainable project. Historic preservation focuses on repair of existing materials and existing wood and things like that. Wood window repair is something you always hear us talk about versus replacing. When you replace a material, you are kind of starting that new life cycle for something. A lot of times it is coming from China or another country, and so think about all of the energy and resources that it takes to get something here. And then we know that those new products also have their own life cycle. And so after 15, 20 years, they need to be replaced again. And so we have this kind of endless cycle of things that are having a negative impact on the environment. So looking at reuse as a big picture approach to the way that we live in our homes and develop and build new is something that's important and preservation is folded into. In terms of neighborhoods, so existing infrastructure, again, I kind of mentioned combating urban sprawl and the reliance on new water lines and new streets and the maintenance for those streets. All of that is an important reason to look at investing in existing older neighborhoods. And you'll hear us throw around the term historic resources. That's really kind of a high-level term that gets used all the time. Historic and cultural resources is often used. And really, existing buildings are just that. They're a resource that's available to us as a community, and then we can look at them in terms of our policy on how we use them and meeting our goals for either climate action or affordable housing or whatever it is we're trying to accomplish. It's our choice to use them or to waste them, because once something goes away, once a building is demolished, it goes to the landfill and we can't get it back. And don't take my word for it. There's a lot of science and a lot of research that's gone into this over the decades. So the AIA, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and then there's a really great economic firm called Place Economics that really looks at the economics of heritage and place and historic preservation. And so all of these are very easily accessible. There's been a lot more recently about the importance of investing in older existing buildings, whether it's preservation or an adaptive reuse. That's what we call anytime you reuse an existing structure. Those are just smart ways to do development. So a little bit of a history lesson, and I'm terrible in terms of being like a history teacher. I like to talk about like our policy and things like that. But how did we get here? And so obviously in the United States, we don't have like the oldest history compared to cities in Europe and other places. So really kind of the 19th century started with kind of those places that everyone knew were important to our American local history. So Mount Vernon, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association formed to save Washington's home. And Independence Hall, there was a rally to kind of save Independence Hall from demolition in Philadelphia. And then our Civil War battlefields, everybody understood the importance of let's protect these from development. Let's not lose these important places where these things happened. The first kind of federal actions took place at the early 1900s with the Antiquities Act. That was the first kind of federal protections that were in place. You think about public lands and national monuments, that's what that act did with some of the early national parks and national monuments. 1926, this is really important. So early 1900s, a lot of cities started using zoning to regulate what could be well built where, and then also how things were shaped when they were built. And so I think a lot of people are familiar with like in New York City where they were building all these full block skyscrapers. The zoning was used to allow light to get down to the streets. And so it impacted the shapes of the buildings, and that's why things like Rockefeller Center, built in the 20s, stair-step backwards so that the sunlight can get down to the street where a lot of people walk and live. Zoning was also used to say, like, here's the parts of town that we want to invest in versus other parts of town, and it was really kind of racist policy for a while. So just know that these were things that cities were doing over time, and it has evolved over time, and began to raise a lot of questions about, well, wait, what is it the city is doing, and is this legal? And so in 1926, this was the first time local zoning laws were upheld by the Supreme Court, and it really created sort of the understanding that zoning was one of those police powers that cities could do to create ordinances to ensure safety and quality of life for its residents. In 1931 was the first local historic district, so that was in Charleston. And then really most local historic districts didn't happen until like the 60s and 70s. Our first local historic district was King William in the 60s, and many are more recent than that. 1935, the Historic Sites Act, so National Historic Landmarks were created at a federal level. But the really big thing was in 1966. This is the one that kind of set everything in place, and it's the National Historic Preservation Act. NHPA, we talk about it all the time in our jargony preservation world. So this created the National Register of Historic Places, the creation of National Register of Historic Districts and Landmarks. It established a criteria that professionals use to decide what makes a property historic and how we treat it, and so what is the right kind of protocol when approaching changes to that property. It established the state historic preservation offices, and so there's the federal level, and each state has its own SHPO, is what we call it, State Historic Preservation Office, and the ACHP, which is the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Don't worry, I'm going to talk more about these in a little bit. And also established the Section 106 review process. And so this is the process that all federal agency must follow when they have an undertaking, and I'll explain that in a little bit, to weigh the impacts to historic and cultural resources. And this act was really, as you see in the picture, Save Penn Station. A lot of people associate this kind of landmark act with the effort to save Penn Station, which was demolished and lost in New York City to build Madison Square Garden. And really what we see, the trend is 60s, lots of growth, lots of infrastructure, highway systems. Cities were rapidly changing, and everyone's like, whoa, 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 whoa. We gotta like hit the brakes and figure out what the best way to review these and understand the impacts to our cities are. So in San Antonio, similar. Around early 1900s, you had people like Clara Driscoll and Adina de Zavala with the Alamo and Spanish Governor's Palace, making sure that we didn't lose these things that were important and significant to Texas history. But again, it was going to be infrastructure that was that driving force here locally. So 1921 was the big flood. 1924, following were some major flood control efforts. There was proposals to create a bypass channel, which you see here, but the original proposal was to make that a big storm sewer. So you would just have, pavement on top, buildings on top, and the sewer would be underneath. And people at the Conservation Society said, wait, we don't want to lose those things. This channel impacted the Market House, which was a 19th century structure on Market Street, but right in the middle of where this channel was going. And so ultimately that was lost. But what was won was preserving the openness of River Park at the time, which would later become the River Walk. So all of this infrastructure was done in the 1920s. Those bridges are still there. The channel has changed a little bit. And you can see, here, let me turn on my pointer here. This is kind of fun. You see this little river waterfall from the horseshoe of the river bend. And so this is before the Riverwalk was built. So now this is all the same level of water level. And then obviously there's been development since then, and bridges and things like that. But you can kind of see the changes that have happened over time. So really big in San Antonio was the WPA era. There were architects working here like Harvey Smith and O'Neill Ford, who used those federal resources to reconstruct and preserve the missions. A lot of work in our local parks at Brackenridge Park and San Pedro Springs. And then La Villita also was restored during that time in the 1930s by O'Neill Ford. And then this also led to the development of the Riverwalk as we know it today. In the 1960s, we had our first review board established, and then following shortly was the designation of the King William Historic District, which was the first historic district in the state of Texas. And so really changes in King William was what that board did for a while, and as well as Riverwalk projects. And then obviously that role of that board has grown over time to what we have today. We have 2 boards that review cases today. And then the big one here locally was in 1988. So kind of mid-1986, 1987, there was a large citywide effort to survey. And so there was a committee that met to identify and recommend landmarks for historic designation. And there was one ordinance where all of these landmarks were included for the first time. And a little over 1,000 landmarks were done at once in the 1980s. And this was before we really even knew what to do with them. And so it was a big ordinance, landmark ordinance for the city. And then obviously we have added more landmarks over time, and I'll talk about how many we have today in a little bit. And then finally, and so we had a historic preservation office for years, obviously. Those functions were housed in the planning department. Many of you know Ann McGlone, who was the historic preservation officer, the last historic preservation officer under the planning department. And then when she left, there was really kind of a community-driven effort to make the Office of Historic Preservation its own city department. And so in 2008, that was done. And Shannon Miller, my boss, was its first director. So shifting gears a little bit, going back and looking at that high-level preservation at all levels of government. And so these are sort of the key agencies to understand here in San Antonio. So we have the National Park Service. So they administer a few things at the federal level, so federal agencies. So they maintain the National Register of Historic Places. Obviously, they do more. The National Parks system and all of that, but these are the things related to preservation. They administer the Historic Preservation Fund. This is a congressional allocation of funding that happens once a year. Sometimes we have to wait for it, and it's every other year. But essentially, the NPS gets that money, and it funds different programs, grants, and a big part of the individual state budgets. And so a lot of that will go to the state historic preservation offices as well. Staff at the NPS are the ones that write and evaluate and publish the standards and review criteria for the treatment of historic properties. And they also are the reviewers and administrators of the federal historic tax credit. Also at the federal level, there's something called the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. This is a standalone agency who is charged with administering the Section 106 process. And don't worry, I'm going to talk more about that on a whole separate slide. But that's the process by which all federal agencies will have to follow to understand whether or not what they're doing will impact historic resources. And so sometimes with the stakeholders, there's not always agreement on whether or not something that the federal government is doing is an impact or not. And so the ACHP are sort of the arbitrators of that process, and they do conflict resolution and facilitate streamlining and things like that. Local or at the state level, we have the Texas Historical Commission. They're our SHPO, our State Historic Preservation Office. They administer a portion of the Historic Preservation Fund, and so some of that is federal funding. But then here in Texas, and they're all different. But here in Texas, they are state funded as well. But there's other offices, other states where the HPF allocation is pretty much their whole budget, and so we are fortunate to be well staffed here in Texas. In Texas, we have the Texas Antiquities Code, and so that is its own kind of set of regulations in Texas that impacts all undertakings on public property. And so every time we put a shovel down for a street project or infrastructure, we have to make sure that we're following the Antiquities Code of Texas, and I'll explain what we do for compliance there later on. The THC is also the ones that will do the determinations of adverse effect under the Section 106 process. Again, I'll get into detail there. And they also manage a large number of historic sites. So here we have Casa Navarro in San Antonio. That's owned by the THC and staffed by the THC, and so that is one of their historic sites, but they have them all over the state. Here at OHP, at the San Antonio Office of Historic Preservation, we are what is called a certified local government, and that is a certification that is through the National Park Service and confirmed by the THC. So we're all working together all the time on our program and making sure that we're in compliance and doing the things that we should be doing. Our main task is administering the UDC, which is the Unified Development Code, and other relevant policies, but most of our stuff is housed in the UDC. Who has heard of that before? That's where our zoning ordinances live, the rules for changing the use of a property, how tall it can be, all of those things live in the UDC. We have an ongoing survey and designation effort, and so this is how we identify new historic properties, and all of that facilitates development so that we know what we're getting into as we do projects. We manage and staff our local commissions. We keep the city in compliance with whatever applicable regulations. Sometimes they're our own, sometimes they're state and federal regulations as well. And then we also participate in Section 106, and then I will get into that right now. So Section 106, it is a section of the National Historic Preservation Act. That's why it's called that, and it's kind of weird. But essentially, this exists to ensure that cultural resources, historic resources, are factored into federal agency planning and decisions. So anytime there's a federal undertaking, and so an undertaking is defined by any time the government is spending money or something is impacting federal property. And it's a lot of things. There's tens of thousands of federal undertakings every year, and a lot of these are streamlined through simplified processes. You can imagine if the Army was needing to do something quickly, well, they're not going to wait for this process. But there are other things, and so like if HUD gives a grant to a project to build a new affordable housing project in a community, we have time to look at that and understand the impacts to that community in terms of historic and cultural resources. It also engages tribes, and so in addition to state preservation offices, each tribe, federally recognized tribe, has a tribal historic preservation officer that participates. And so every region has tribes that are associated and identified on the front end that are invited to participate in that process. And the invitation looks like, okay, you told us what you're doing, and we're asking you if we think there's anything historic there, and a lot of times there's not. A lot of times it's they need to put in a cell phone tower or something that is in the middle of a field and isn't really going to impact anything, but sometimes it does. Sometimes there's archaeology, sometimes there might be Native American resources that we need to understand what that impact is, and sometimes the visual impact is part of that as well, and so it is a pretty comprehensive process. So whatever agency is responsible for the undertaking, it is their job to facilitate the process. They usually do this through a consultant, and I used to do this before my time here at the city. I was an environmental consultant, so if you have to do something which triggers NEPA or requires an environmental assessment, part of that is cultural resources, and so I would go in and I would fill in my part of the report for the environmental assessments for federal undertakings. We did a lot of work for the VA system and Air Force bases, and it was really, really boring. But some people make that a career and love it. I really like working at local government. It's more interesting, and I'll kind of explain why here in a little bit. So very often, we as the city are invited to help identify what is potentially impacted locally, and so our ongoing survey initiative is part of what helps inform that process. And so our survey information is usually readily available online, and so those consultants are pulling from our online maps or online past studies, and so they're drafting it and they're saying, hey, does this look right? And we can say yes or no, you missed something important, and sometimes that does happen. So although this is a very kind of bureaucratic federal process, there are benefits to the local community. It gives you a seat at the table. There's a federal project that is in the River Road Historic District neighborhood, and so River Road has been invited to be a stakeholder in the review process, and so they have a seat at the table in that federal undertaking by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So if there is a negative impact, and very often there are, we already are saying that there is one in the River Road project because there is a WPA era resource that is impacted, the low water crossing. And so that requires mitigation. And so the federal agency and their consultants will draft an MOA with all of the stakeholders, and they will say, here's what we're doing, here's the negative impact, here's what we're doing to mitigate that negative impact. And usually it's not avoiding it. Usually it's not shutting down the project, you can't do it. You have to mitigate for it. And so a lot of times it's documentation of the resource that's being lost. And so there's a whole other thing called HABs, which is the Historic American Building Survey. And so there's standards for coming in and documenting and creating drawings of that resource before it's demolished. A lot of times it's money. So sometimes there's funding put into a special fund for preservation of other similar resources. And sometimes that's money that's available to the local community as well. And so just important to participate in that process and advocate for your community when those opportunities come up. And again, local knowledge is important. And what's really interesting is sometimes there's crossover between the federal undertaking and something that also comes to our local review board, the HDRC. And so I always try to facilitate those reviews so that they're happening at the same time, and then ideally the local board is informing what the city is saying about the project. Those timelines don't always line up, but we try to kind of align those reviews when we can. Works Progress Administration, that was one of the agencies during the New Deal period that were using federal funds to create jobs and projects. Okay, so the National Park Service, remember I said that they create the standards that we use to evaluate these. And so these are called the Secretary of the Interior Standards. They were first created in the 70s and have been kind of updated over time. They've pretty much have been the same for more than 30 years at this point. Last update was in 1992. It defines the 4 main preservation treatments. So preservation, so let's pretend that you have a perfect, pretty building that is untouched. What interventions are needed to keep it nice and pretty and maintained and untouched? That's preservation with a capital P. Rehabilitation, this is the one that is used most commonly. Every property is in a different level of condition. They have mostly been changed over time. And so the standards for rehabilitation consider things as they are. You don't have to go and restore it, but we look at identifying what are the character-defining features that remain on the property, what are the original elements that should be preserved, and then also how can they be changed in a way that is appropriate and responsive to those existing remaining features. And so the rehabilitation standards are the ones that a lot of local rules are based on, and that is recommended through the Certified Local Government Program, which I'll talk about. But just know that's the big one. And then the other two small ones are restoration. If you are going to do a restoration, how do you decide what it should look like? And so it's evidence-based, forensic-based sometimes, and then reconstruction. So there are standards for, okay, we've already lost something, we're going to rebuild it. What is the best approach to doing that? Structurally, is it the same? Does it look the same? Et cetera. So again, the standards for rehabilitation are the ones that consider alterations, and they are applied at those state and federal level reviews. And here locally, we have a version that's been adopted. So again, this is maintained by the National Park Service. And then the other thing that they help with are the release of preservation briefs and technical briefs. And so these kind of get into, these are just resources that anybody can use. If a consultant's working on a project and they want to show that they are meeting the federal standards for something, they will say, we're referencing this preservation brief and we're doing XYZ according to the brief, and then everyone nods. Okay, a little more about here at the state, the Antiquities Code of Texas. So this requires the THC to give a permit to, usually it's the city, but it can impact private property as well. So there's a couple of things that trigger it. You heard me say that any shovel on public property is going to trigger it for archaeology. That is true. But there's also designations that could trigger it. So you could be a private property owner that owns a state antiquities landmark. Those can sometimes be a building. They are more often an archaeological resource. But you would also be subject to that state permitting if you were one of those property owners. There's not many. The city owns a lot of these. So a lot of the older buildings in Hemisphere, those became SALs as mitigation. And so, again, you hear me, so the Section 106 process are sometimes mitigation. Sometimes the mitigation is a designation. And so they'll say, yeah, you can do this, but you got to make all these buildings over here SAL so this doesn't happen again. So that has happened a lot in San Antonio. A lot of the buildings in La Villita are SALs and require individual permits from the state every time we touch them. All of Brackenridge Park is an SAL, and so anytime we do something in Brackenridge Park, we've got to coordinate with the state and make sure we're meeting all of those standards at the federal level. And then, and just anecdotally, like many of our public works and bond projects trigger this. This is why we have an in-house city archaeologist. This is really the meat of his job, is clearing these projects. Street projects, even like new construction above ground projects, new community centers and things through the bond, those are going to need to be cleared. And so for archaeology, and so Matt, our archaeologist, is able to coordinate that and facilitate that for the city. If we had to bring in an outside consultant for every time we were, again, putting a shovel in the ground, it would be very expensive and time consuming to do that. Okay, so at the state level again, the Texas has a section in its statutes that is the local government code, and so this is what establishes the home rule authority of cities within the state to create laws that can protect the health, safety, welfare, and quality of life for its residents. And this all goes back to those past Supreme Court decisions that says cities can do this. We have the responsibility for doing things on behalf of our residents. And preservation is one of those things that's widely been accepted as something that contributes to the welfare of its residents. So the local government code contains all of the rules for zoning and land use, building codes, for enforcement of dangerous structures and abatement and things like that. We follow all those rules in the local government code. Now, obviously, we can't do anything that is opposite of what the state says we can do. We have to comply and conform with the state statutes. But very often, there's just blanks. There's gray area and apps, like things that are not in the code that we can then introduce things that are more specific. And so, our preservation program is similar to other cities and much more specific than what's in the state code. But it never fails. Time after time, the state law is becoming more and more specific. Every session, they think of new things to add in there. and they, politically, they look at what other similar-minded states are doing, and they say, we're going to do that too. And so you hear this term state preemption, and that's really kind of a big thing, is a lot of states are now going in, conservative states, I should say, are going in and adding rules about what cities can and can't do. And so that is impacting our ability to create new ordinances, and very often after state sessions, we have to modify or update our ordinances to match so that there's no longer a conflict. Okay, you heard me say CLG, or Certified Local Government Program. So this is through the National Park Service, and this is basically authorized through the Historic Preservation Fund Grants Manual. And so it's saying, like, here's what a city would have to do to be eligible for funding through the HPF. And so we can, on an annual basis, apply for grants that are administered through the state, that are funded through this funding source. And we do. Very often it'll fund special projects or surveys or things that we need to do that we don't have the budget for. Many cities use it for survey or to write national register nominations or determinations of eligibility for properties. And so this is funding that's available to cities that are in compliance with the CLG program. So the CLG program can be used by cities or counties. Counties can receive funding as well. It has kind of high-level ordinance requirements, and so we have to have an established review board. We have to have the historic preservation officer position that is assigned to somebody. Here, it's the director of the Office of Historic Preservation. In most other communities, it is a planner, a city planner that gets to wear the HPO hat like 1% of the time. We have to have a process for COAs, which is the Certificate of Appropriateness, and so that's the thing that you need to do work to the exterior of your property, and so we administer that process. And then we have to maintain a register or a process and a list of historic landmarks locally. We have to adopt review criteria, and the grants manual says that we need to refer to those Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. So here we have historic design guidelines that have been drafted and adopted, and those standards or those guidelines are consistent with the standards. And so that's one of the ways that we're kind of in keeping with the program. And again, one thing that we do is public participations and trainings for our commissioners and for the public. And we have to maintain records like meeting minutes and things like that. There's an organization that I am on the board of that is the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, and we are the primary training partner with CLGs, and so we offer something called CAMP, which is Commission Assistance and Mentoring Program, and it is training for local staff and local commissions, review boards that do this, and we make sure that they are getting training on all of these things, that the Secretary of the Interior standards, best practices, and preservation policy, and we partner with the CLGs to fund those trainings and bring in trainers, and so that's one of the ways that HPF money is used. Okay, high level, before I get into kind of the nuts and bolts of the department, in San Antonio, our policy is set by city council, not staff, and so our job is to administer the policies established by council. Our job is to administer the policies set by council. And so that includes the UDC, anything that has been previously adopted by council or is in an ordinance. The historic design guidelines were adopted by council, and so those policies are our job to administer, sometimes interpret, and we make sure that all of the things that are happening in the city are consistent with that adopted policy. The Unified Development Code, which I mentioned, is pretty sacred. There's a lot of kind of important stuff in there, and a lot of things, a lot of rules that impact development, and so it is important that we look at changes to the UDC carefully, and so the UDC actually has a codified update cycle of 5 years. We don't touch it unless there is a special consideration by council to update something, or unless we need to do it because state law changed. We don't make up new rules for a 5-year period. When that 5-year period opens, it's kind of a mad dash. We have a task force that meets, different departments, and the public can recommend amendments. Those get vetted and worked to death, to be honest, if you ever participated in that process. But all of that is so that there's good oversight, and we're making sure that the rules are going to be enforceable and workable and easy to follow. And so that is an important thing to look at, and we'll be doing this again, not next year, but the year after. I think The cycle will start in 2027, but next year in 2026, our department will probably start working with the public and stakeholders to identify whether there should be updates, and that way we can have some public input going into the process. The UDC itself has the rules about the COA process, and so what triggers a COA, whether it's an alteration or a demolition of a historic landmark, if it's new construction in a historic district. There's a specific process by which demolition permits are reviewed, and now we have deconstruction, and so sometimes the deconstruction ordinance is triggered. It's the process by which we can create a new historic landmark or a new historic district, which is a very, very specific process and has been tweaked not only at City Council but also by the state over the past decade. So there are very rigid steps that we have to follow to create a new historic district because of all of these policy decisions. Application completeness, so what do you have to submit to the city to get an answer? What is the process for appealing a decision and all of that? And then I'll mention this later, but it's not just historic at OHP. We also have the River Improvement Overlay District and the downtown design area, and so there's a lot of urban design projects that aren't necessarily historic that will come through our review process. And again, the adoption of the historic design guidelines as the guiding policy for alterations to historic properties. Y'all get this? So this is a meme where the guy is like confused. So the original one, he sees a butterfly and he asks if it's a pigeon, like he's confused. And so, it never fails. Like preservation obviously has a lot of benefits. We believe here, I think a lot of you would agree that it high level creates sustainable communities and is a good benefit to the community. But it never fails. Like people, developers, property owners will argue it's a regulatory taking. Like we can't create rules that make a property unusable. That's held up in Supreme Court law. And so a regulatory taking is when we have so many rules on a property that it's rendered useless. Well, historic preservation doesn't really do that. We don't impact the use of the property. We allow you to alter and change the property. And so there's always a path forward to reuse. This argument is mostly made when a new property is designated and that person didn't want it to be designated, and so they say, well, what can I do now? I can't do my project. You've rendered it useless. But there has been, just so you know, a lot of case history and previous decisions about this, so it is enforceable, it is upheld in the state and federal laws, and it is not a regulatory taking, but it is important to kind of understand how this fits into the overall development process. So best practices, how do we avoid these arguments or how do we support a defensible preservation program? So it is important that any rules are codified and backed up by zoning, and so we don't apply our rules for historic properties unless that property is zoned historic. And when you zone something, that property owner has notice. They understand the rules that apply based on the zoning. That zoning has gone to City Council, so they have all agreed that the rules are going to apply to this property. The zoning is part of the public notice, so it is on your deed, it is available at BCAD. You should know that your property is historic and what the rules are that apply to you, and just know that that's really important. It is important as something comes to the process that property owners have due process. So we tell them the rules, we tell them what to expect in the process. We give them their options. They can work within the confines of the rules. They can try to get something else approved. They can appeal. There are remedies for somebody that is not happy with the outcome of a decision. But then also, a lot of that is also just hand-holding. Like, if we support the applicant in the process, we help them know what to expect, then they have a higher likelihood of being successful. And so we don't just put people on their own when they come up here, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Balance is really important. So, all policy should be developed with public input and reflect our overarching community goals. It is not what I decide. It's what all of us decides, and that gets codified by City Council. Decisions should really be based on whether or not it meets or doesn't meet the adopted policy. It cannot be whether or not the neighborhood likes it or doesn't like it. It really shouldn't be whether Cory likes it or doesn't like it. Again, we're always going to go back to the adopted policy, and we're going to review based on the adopted policy. And again, documentation and transparency. And so I think a lot of you who follow our process know that you can go on our website and look at the map and see everything that's coming and everything that's gone. And so that transparency is also important, helping somebody to understand what they should also expect in their own property. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about OHP. Are there any questions about anything that I've covered so far? I know this is a lot of information, and this will be recorded, and we're happy to share any of this if y'all want to reference it later. So in San Antonio, we have 32 local historic districts. About half of these are almost exclusively residential neighborhoods. And so we have some really, really large neighborhoods that are also historic districts. Monticello Park, Monte Vista, Dignity Hill. These are massive, massive historic districts with more than 1,000 properties each. And really a bulk of the requests that come before us are in some of these neighborhoods. And so it's not just kind of the commercial developers in downtown, like the residential component, and really the reason that we do things like this is really important because it's a big piece of the pie here. We do over 2,000 of these reviews annually. We know through reporting with the state that this is a pretty high volume compared to other cities in the state. Like you think about like Dallas and Austin, they're not doing nearly the level of reviews that we are. Austin's doing a lot of demolition reviews. We don't do as many as them. But in terms of historic properties that require approval, San Antonio has a much higher number than other cities. Obviously, things are changing, and so preservation plays a role as one of those kind of regulatory tools that are available for neighborhoods and informing and talking about what changes should be made and when. So again, I mentioned we have historic properties, Rio districts, the downtown area, and then sometimes there's adopted view sheds as well. There's one for the Alamo, and there's 4 for the southernmost Spanish missions. And so sometimes it's a height question that's reviewed by our staff as well. There are 2 review boards. We have our Historic and Design Review Commission, which most of you are familiar with, the HDRC. And then for a couple of years now, we've had the CTAB, the Compliance and Technical Advisory Board. And so this is a newer board, and we have a commissioner here who I think tried to hide, but sorry, she's here, that reviews technical questions about changes in materials, as well as violations. So if a property was altered without approval and that needs to be remedied, sometimes there's a lot of discussions and compromises and site visits that need to happen, and so that board will kind of deal with those as they come up. The other thing we review is public property, and so all city parks, but then also kind of major projects, infrastructure projects, will trigger a COA sometimes, especially if they have historic significance, again, like Brackenridge Park or San Pedro Springs. But any new sort of community center or park facility, those require COA and will often come for a public hearing. Fire stations, libraries, those sorts of things. So again, the department itself has been around since 2008, but there has been historic preservation staff in the planning department prior to that for decades. We are one of the largest municipal programs in the country. A lot of people will say, oh, San Antonio, like you have it all. But if you look at our actual kind of caseload per case manager distribution, we're staffed pretty similarly to other large cities, even like New York. So New York has like more than 10,000 reviews that they do. Like the volume is overwhelming, but they have like 80 people that do it. And so if you kind of divide that up, we're similarly staffed. Again, we're a certified local government. That's that National Park Service kind of affiliation. And we are really seen nationally as a leader in outreach and engagement. Now they're all doing it, but when Shannon Miller became the first director, we were the only city department doing hands-on trainings. We were the only city department doing things like the Amazing Preservation Race and the Homeowners Fair. And so we've really been kind of a leader nationally in those areas. And then program areas, I think this was on a previous slide, but so I oversee our design review and archaeology and Scout SA. And so the design review is like the permits and approvals to do work to the exterior of a historic property or build something downtown. Scout SA is our branding for our heritage programs, and so that's our ongoing survey and designation initiatives. That's our cultural initiatives, which includes cultural heritage districts and cultural context statements and a lot of other cool stuff. We manage the city's vacant buildings program, and so there's certain maintenance requirements if a building's vacant, but it applies to all historic properties, and that includes districts and landmarks, so it makes sense that it's in our department. And then newer, we have a couple of people that staff our deconstruction and circular economy program. And so the deconstruction program requires that when an old building comes down, those materials are salvaged in a very specific way so that they can be reused. And so all of that is really aimed at environmental sustainability and avoiding landfill waste. And really the benefit is those materials become available for reuse in other projects. And then we also manage a transformational projects division, which is really our coordination with Alamo Plaza. We have right now an exciting project for a strategic plan for the Riverwalk that will be coming in the next few months. Activations like events, holidays on Houston, some of those things that you've been seeing in the few years, our office leads those. So here's the really fun stuff, regulatory reviews. I know if you own a historic property, like this is something that you're familiar with, and it's kind of the headache, like, okay, here's what I gotta do. So I'm gonna talk about, what these are and some of the ways that we help to make it less painful. But it is what it is. Like the code says you need a COA, and so you need a COA. And so as permits come in, we look at them to see if it's going to include an exterior scope, and if it is, we'll flag it for a COA, and that will require you to come and work with us to get that COA, and we'll ask for pictures, and we'll ask for drawings, and we'll make sure that your project meets the adopted policies, which is our historic design guidelines. We do the demolition permit reviews, so there, if a property comes in for a demolition that's not historic, we still look at it, and the point is that we need to identify whether or not something is eligible for designation before we sign off on it. So there is a very long, narrow path for something becoming a landmark as a result of a demolition request. We don't do it much, and this is very kind of stringent based on state law, and so it is something that City Council can do, but we don't often do. And then, that process, the landmark and district designation process. And so I think I talked about these other things. I'm going to keep going. So when we look at a review, when something comes to us and the question is, can I build this addition? Can I reconstruct the front porch? Can I change the siding material? We look at these all individually. The first step is really understanding what the resource is. And if you follow HCRC, we have those staff reports. The first bullet is always, this house was built in 1910, and it's in the King William Historic District, and it's a full Victorian, and here's its materials. You have to understand what it is you're looking at before you can understand how to treat it. And so we make sure that that's kind of spelled out for our commissioners. We use the term character defining features, and so there are certain elements that all houses have that might be indicative of its style. You think about a craftsman house in particular. Some of those character defining features might be those tapered columns, those box columns, or the brackets that are on the eaves so the porch can hang out further. Those are all craftsman elements, and so they become character defining, and those are the things that we want to make sure are protected when an alteration occurs. We work with the applicant and the property owner to understand what are your project goals, what are you trying to accomplish. Sometimes they don't know. Sometimes they just gave it to a contractor and the contractor knows what he wants to do. And so having those conversations with the owner themselves and sometimes with the contractor together kind of helps us get across that finish line and understand what they're trying to accomplish. And we might give them suggestions and recommendations to meet the policies. There is also the question of whether or not our, meeting the requirement is feasible. And so, the HCRC, they're usually the ones that look at this if there's a cost prohibition, or if there's something that, this material would be ideal, but it's not really available because of COVID and supply chain issues. That was a really big question a few years ago. We can consider the feasibility of meeting those requirements in evaluating the request. We look at whether or not the impacts are readily visible from the street. Is it something on the front of the house? A front door really should be preserved, but a back door, not as much. And so there is a little bit of flexibility depending on, if it's on a primary or non-primary facade. But the common misconception is that we don't review things on the back of the house, but we do. You still have to show us, you still have to get approval, but there's flexibility. And then could the alteration, and this points back to the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, could the alteration be considered reversible or temporary or something that could be easily modified in the future? And so there are ways to build an addition where it could come off and the original house could still be there the same way. A really good example is the new Kimpton Hotel on South Alamo, and it's hard to see because South Alamo has been torn up for 5 years. But that has an addition. It's basically an addition to the German English School, which is a 19th century stone building, highly significant. But they did it in a way where they didn't remove any stone to do that addition, and they used an existing doorway. And the thing that touches the stone is glass. And so that entire hotel project could go away someday, and the German English School would essentially be the same. And so, yeah, we look at like kind of the visual impacts, and it has to be set back and not overwhelming, but the actual way it touches those historic materials and original portions of the building is something that's considered too. We always say that it's about progress, not perfection. I always tell my son, who's stressed out about grades, like it's like practice makes progress, not perfection. It is very tempting because we see a lot of good projects, and so we want to make everyone do good projects, but you do not have to have a perfect preservation project to be approved. It just has to meet the adopted policy. And so it is just something to keep in mind that we don't design people's projects for them. We do a lot of hand-holding. We do, but they're on their own after we review it. What makes a successful program? So it is important that what we do is strengthened through public support, and that's really the reason that we do things like this today. Again, I can only be effective at my job if there's people like Ricky in her neighborhood that are reminding people what the rules are and what the process are, and she serves on a committee that reviews things and makes recommendations to our commission. That is really, really helpful and beneficial to the process as a whole. It is important that the process, capital P process, is transparent and easy to understand. I got up here and I used a lot of jargony technical language, and so I can't give an hour presentation to every applicant, and so we really work with them to kind of give kind of the base level understanding of what this means and what to expect in the process, so that they can navigate it on their own. It is important that you don't go into this blind, that you understand, okay, if I do X, Y, Z, then this is what will happen more than likely, and so there needs to be predictability in the process. And then if there is an appeal or if there is a question after an action is taken, that it's important that whatever decision was made is defensible. So again, we're always pointing back to the adopted policy. It's not about opinion, it's not about preference, it's not about it being perfect or not, it's about whether or not it meets policy. I've kind of said these things, but again, like the philosophy is that the whole process is approachable, accessible. If you are a residential applicant for a COA, there's no fee, and that's really, really important. We looked at what other cities charge, and the fee structure is across the board, but a lot of people don't charge for residential alterations, and so it is important that you all aren't burdened with an additional fee just because you live in a historic district. Now, the rules are what they are, but you don't have to pay just to get into the door and ask a question. We try to be as quick as possible. So we have an adopted schedule, application deadline schedule, and hearing date schedule. And so you get an application to us, it's complete. You are going to be on the next HCRC agenda and hopefully get your answer within a couple of weeks' time. And all of this, again, encourages participation. Don't tell anyone, but if nobody followed the rules, it would be really, really hard for us to do anything about it because, enforcement is challenging already. And so they're laughing. But it's true. Like, we need you all to be participatory in this process, and the neighborhoods being established as historic districts and being invested in this process is what really helps. Peer pressure helps. Yeah, well, that's not good either. Like, we want to train neighborhoods so that they understand this and can be resources, not so that they can intimidate you. Yeah. Yeah, I mentioned that the economic impact study we did, one of the things we looked at, because people always ask, I live in a historic district, is my property valuation going to be higher because I'm in a district versus not? Or our neighborhood might become a historic district. Is that going to make our taxes go up automatically? And the answer is no, but over time you will see them trending at a slightly higher rate in terms of valuation, and that reflects investment. And so in a historic district, we know that the owners there made a decision. Usually some of them didn't know, but most of them made a decision to live there, and they made a decision to invest in those homes. And so you do see you see longer home ownership and you see more investment. So of course you see higher valuations for that reason. Yeah. So we always prepare applicants for their review. Like, we'll let them know what to expect. We make sure that they understand the rules and have the tools that they need to be successful. Sometimes this is pointing them to things that are on the internet, like some of our past articles or resources that we put together, pointing them to the home repair fair, inviting them to things like this. We have a resource called the Rehabber Club, which is a list of contractors that do work on historic properties. And there's another one by a guy named Scott that lives in Lavaca, Scott's List, and he has a really good one. People rate the contractors, and so that's a good resource too. So we share all of that. We are honest with people. If you come to us with something that we know is not going to be approved, we'll tell you. Like, we're not going to waste your time. We'll let you know what to expect. And some people are really receptive to that and like, oh, great, I don't want any trouble. I don't want to present from the board. I just want to be approved. And they'll work with us. And then other people don't. They want to have their day at the HCRC, and that's fine too. But we just let them know what to expect. And all of this is through excellent communication. We follow up in writing. We are available for site visits and over the phone as well. But we communicate at every step in the process. I mentioned we have online resources. There's a map where you can go and you can see everything. That's for a future session where we'll go in and show you like what the portal is and where to apply and how to see the past approvals, but we're not going to get in that today because there's a lot out there. We do allow people to participate in the hearings remotely. After COVID, we maintain a hybrid kind of meeting model for our commission hearings. And so if you want to speak on a project but can't get here at 3 p.m. in the middle of the week to attend a hearing, you can leave a voicemail, and that voicemail will be played as public comment. And so a lot of people take advantage of that. We have, for a while, had a Historic Districts Coalition, which is really a group of volunteers that kind of meets on a used to be regular basis. Sorry, we haven't been meeting as much anymore. Some of them are here. And this is really kind of to guide things like this. What are the things that people are confused about, or there's misconceptions? What should we have a training session on? And then as things like QDC amendments come up, we will engage those groups on feedback on potential changes to the policies. And then meetings like this. So I mentioned this, so demolition of a historic building, if it is already designated, a lot of people think, well, I can't demolish it because it's a landmark, and that's mostly true, but there is a path that you can seek approval to demolish a historic landmark. It is a narrow one. You have to demonstrate economic hardship, and there's all sorts of things that you can provide per the code to demonstrate that. Or there could be a loss of significance. So if there was something catastrophic that happened where essentially most of the building is lost, then that might be the reason for issuing an approval to demolish a historic landmark. It has a longer review period, and there's a public notice period, and people participate. We have site visits with the commissioners, and so these decisions are made very, very seriously. And really, that's one of the main reasons to designate something, is so that there is a thorough evaluation for what happens if those things need to go away. We want to carefully talk about when a landmark is lost forever, right? Sometimes this buys time. We will work with development services to enforce like safety concerns, and so this building's been boarded up. We normally don't like to do that under the vacant buildings program. We like it to be repaired. But if there's an absentee property owner or there's a lot of reasons why somebody may not be able to do that, we will try to keep the building secure, and best case scenario, they sell it and somebody else buys the property and is able to do the rehab. So it's not just historic properties, there's infill development too. This is really important if you live in a neighborhood that has vacant lots. And so this is a map, and the dots are kind of hard to see. So this is every time we've had a request for infill construction. So this could be a new home, it could be a new apartment complex. You see a lot of them downtown, but you also see a lot of them here in this neighborhood. So this is Dignity Hill. They've had somewhere like 80 or 90 infill requests over the past decade. And so those new construction projects also have an impact on the quality and character of the neighborhood. And so we have, in the historic design guidelines, rules that have been adopted that kind of guides what those new construction projects look like, how big they are, what the materials are, and the goal is compatibility within the neighborhood. And so these are some more successful ones in historic districts. And I am sharing these because they're coming in all forms. And so this is a multifamily project. These are single family projects. This one is really kind of 2 dwelling units on a single lot, but it meets the zoning requirements. And so these are actually all multifamily. And so you can see that there's been different strategies used to house multiple units within kind of traditional residential forms. So this is a duplex. This is like 4 or 5 units. This is 6 units. And these are more. These are both in King William, and you can imagine the level of participation from a neighborhood like King William for a project like this. And so this developer really took his time and worked on the front end with the neighborhood on what these would look like and how many people would fit in here and where they would park and where the trash cans would go and all that stuff. And so, you know, by the time he came to the HCRC, he didn't have any problems. We were just kind of signing off on the details. The neighborhood already had buy-in at that point. Sometimes things change. And so this is a project in King William. This is what came in for design. They were doing the thing where, you know, this was 5 units. So instead of 5 houses crammed on a lot, they were following the guidelines, which said to kind of group these things together into traditional forms, and they kind of overdid it. Sometimes, like, the zoning allows for 5 units on this property. We always try to work within that base zoning to give them the allowable use, but sometimes it just doesn't fit. And so the guidelines are going to sometimes compete with that. What ended up happening was pulling out these attached garages on the other side. They lost a unit. They broke it into 2 buildings that are more compatible and kind of scaled appropriately for the neighborhood. There are incentives for preservation. So we do have a local tax incentive for substantial rehabilitation. So if you are investing in your historic home, you're doing a big foundation job, you're redoing your wiring, something expensive, or you're doing a full rehab, you can qualify for this. And so this is an abatement against your city's property taxes. We have also worked to expand opportunities for state and federal tax credits. And so this is not administered by the city. This is administered by, there's 2 programs. There's a state program and a federal program. The state program, if you're an income-producing property, you can use it as tax abatement against your state franchise tax. And if if you use the federal credit, you can use it against your federal income tax. So these are for income-producing commercial properties. But a nonprofit can also take advantage of the state credit as well. And that's probably a whole nother session as well, but just know there are incentives. And we have worked to create new National Register districts. We have worked to certify local historic districts so that more people would have access to these additional credits and incentives. For a while now, there has been a fee waiver for certified rehabilitations. So if you are getting this first one, if you're doing the substantial rehabilitation with the city, you automatically qualify for the fee waivers, and so that's going to be your permit fee waivers. And so things like the Tower Life rehabilitation that's happening, they have a lot of fees in terms of like their permit reviews, and so that rehabilitation being certified through us allows them to get fee waivers, which saves them money so that they can spend it on their building. And then there is a small property tax reduction for new historic districts. It's just like a little bonus. It's 20% for 10 years. And so the owners that live in the new historic district get to enjoy that. I want to touch a little bit on SCADA, which is, again, our heritage programs, and that's the program that Charles here works in. And it's really kind of about connecting our residents to place and having kind of that sense of pride in our community. We do, through this program, administer the formal landmark designation and district process, but then we do a little more beyond that. And so there's a few there's a few things that we provide to property owners. One is historic assessments, and we do those demolition reviews. And so if you are a property owner, say you've got a landmark property that has like 5 buildings on it, and you're not sure which ones are historic or which ones are not, we'll look at those. If you are a developer and you think you want to purchase a property that's not a landmark, but it kind of looks like one, and you want to know like what we're going to say about the demolition, if that's what you decide to do, you can submit a request to us and pay us a small fee, and we'll do that historic assessment. That is something that is good for 5 years and can be relayed to a potential buyer. And so a lot of kind of proactive development, land use and development people will look at that as a thing to do. We have a legacy business program, which is really about increasing visibility and for our legacy businesses, because we don't want to lose those. This never fails. There'll be like a demolition of something where there used to be a store or a restaurant that people were fond of, and it wasn't a landmark, so it can be demolished, and maybe the building wasn't even that historic, but people were connected to that place because of what was there. And so this is really proactive about sustaining and supporting those businesses so that doesn't have to happen. We do have a local markers program, and so I think a lot of people are familiar with like the state historical markers on a big bronze plaque. So those, bronze is expensive, and there's a whole process for getting those. It's usually grant funded, but you have to go through your county historical commission, and a lot of people look at it and review the text, and it gets approved, and it's a long process. And so it's not something that a lot of people have access to, or like the ability to kind of initiate for something that they're interested in sharing information on. And so we have history here, which is a local marker that is very affordable and very, staff facilitates that process. We have a community group that works on looking at the text, and we usually will highlight those with like a press event or a blog or something so that people can see that it's been installed. And we also have Tash. There's a story here, Tash. And that is just like an online markers program, and it's more crowdsourced and social, and you can go look at the map and see what stories people have submitted about different places, and it's really fun. And I'll skip to this map, and then I'll go back. So this is on scoutsa.com, and this is where all of those Tash stories have been submitted, as well as things like this. These are story maps, and so you can kind of do a deep dive on Asian bungalows in San Antonio, or about the zoo and some of those things there. These are all things that our staff or interns have worked on. And so, yeah, check it out. I'll give you a second. Okay, let me go back. And then we also have a cultural historian on staff. And so the cultural historian position was created in recognition that not everything that we care about or want to preserve as a community is going to look like an old historic building. Sometimes it's something more intangible. Sometimes it's something less obvious or more reflective of a culture or a group of people than it is than a building. And so they lead things like creation of our cultural heritage districts. We have several now. We have had 2 new ones in the past couple of years. The creation of cultural context statements, and this is something we're working on now. I have a slide for that. And then sometimes there's alternative treatment recommendations. And so following the normal historic design guidelines to a T doesn't make sense for one of these kind of non-traditional properties. And so really kind of looking at that creatively. I'm going to skip that. Local markers. There's a story here, history here. And just going to touch on this. So we are in the final stretch of completing this initiative. And so African American Preservation Initiative, this is kind of a comprehensive look at our African American history in San Antonio. A lot of people think, oh, the East Side, but it's much, much more than that. And so we've been working on developing a cultural context statement, which kind of ties that history of African Americans in San Antonio to place and identifies those places. And so there's been a survey, there'll be a report. There's been already the nomination of the Greater Corinth and Bellinger Estate property in Denver Heights to the National Register of Historic Places. We are about to finish completion of a graphic novel and educational component that relates to that nomination so that people have access to that story. And then all of this will kind of culminate with a local designation initiative. And so we'll be coming forward with a public-driven initiative that is based on all of this, based on the surveys, based on the cultural context statement, to hopefully protect future properties that are associated with African American heritage here in San Antonio. Okay, looking forward. So what are, I said big P preservation earlier, now we're talking about little p preservation. So things that are not actually designated historic, things that may not be subject to kind of the regulatory oversight that traditionally would. What are the things that are important to our city? Affordable housing, climate action, job growth, not losing ourselves, right? Cultural continuity. Preservation policy as a whole contributes to those things. And so in 2018, when really a lot of the policy around affordable housing was kind of being developed here in San Antonio, we had the mayor's task force on housing policy that was working with the public to kind of develop some recommendations. We were doing this, and we were looking at the role that our existing housing stock played in meeting our affordable housing needs. Again, you heard me say earlier, we're not going to build our way out of an affordable housing crisis. There's no way to build affordable housing without government subsidy. It costs money to do that. And a lot of times the subsidy is either in the construction or tax abatement, or it's to actually pay for people to live there. And so the other big piece of the pie is how do we just keep people living affordably as they are now? And a lot of that has to do with housing preservation. And so we looked at where people live, where are people at lower income levels living, what type of housing, and what is the role that our older housing and potentially historic housing is playing in doing that. And so, and again, just as the sentiment that the existing housing stock is the most affordable housing we have to preserve it. We can't just produce new housing, we have to preserve what we have. And so, findings summarized from this study, every week demolition is playing a role in the loss of this housing due to property maintenance. It's not just code enforcement, like that is sometimes the result of deferred maintenance and things like that. But for a fixed income elderly person who has lived in their house their entire life, maintenance is always going to be a struggle. And so we also know that our old buildings are usually housing at-risk communities. They are only about a quarter of all of our housing stock, but they're housing a greater proportion of people at 60% of the area median income and below. If you look at 30% area median income, which is kind of poverty levels, it's an even greater kind of a bucket of housing stock. And so all of this to say, we had the city's housing bond pass about 3 years ago at this point. And so all of that is not just for housing production. Actually, most of it is for housing preservation. And so you have the city's minor repair and major repair programs. Those are programs that are available to homeowners. And then we use at OHP a bit of that money to fund our Rehab-A-Rama program, which is essentially minor repair focusing on pre-1960s housing stock. And so if you live in an older house and you are income qualified, then we will connect you with a contractor to hopefully accomplish some repairs. So we do foundation repair, siding, roofing is most common, really arresting deterioration of those properties, with the goal of buying more time so that that person is able to stay in place for longer. I'm going to touch on deconstruction. This is a new thing too. This is not typical preservation. This is looking at when a building is approved to be demolished, which happens every single day. You saw that stat earlier, about 3 a week. An older housing unit is demolished, and that is just for a variety of reasons. We can't save them all. But what we can do is create policy that says what happens when those buildings are removed. What is the best way to mitigate that demolition? And so deconstruction really came about as an alternative to traditional demolition. It is not an alternate to preservation. If something has to be preserved, if something is historic and is subject to those rules, that's not changing. This is for properties that are not historic and are subject to demolition. If they were built prior to 1960, again, that's our kind of like key date there, then it would have to be taken apart by hand, and those materials would have to be salvaged versus mechanically demolished by a backhoe or machinery and thrown into the landfill. This is not just a historic preservation issue. This is a sustainability, waste reduction, public health, housing, and workforce issue. Oh, sorry, you want to take a picture? So there's a lot of kind of shared interests in deconstruction for a variety of reasons. And so we had the ordinance of itself pass 3 years ago at this point, and expanded most recently at the beginning of this year. And so the current version is that any house, so residential property that was built prior to 1945 or prior, would trigger deconstruction. And then if you're in a historic district or neighborhood conservation district, it's 1960 or older. A big part of the work here is building the workforce and developing trainings for deconstruction contractors. We have one coming up this fall. We've done several others prior. I think we have about 80 or 90 deconstruction contractors that have been trained and know how to do this. And so it's happening, guys. We are seeing about 50 to 60 deconstructions annually. And at each of those sites, I think about 60 to 70% of the materials are able to be salvaged and diverted from the landfill. We also have the Material Innovation Center, which is a partnership with Port SA, so we have a little bit of space out there where we house materials that have been donated to the city. A lot of the materials that we have came from our trainings or were donated. We don't require that a private property owner that's doing a deconstruction give us their materials. That's theirs to do with, and so a lot of them do sell them, and that offsets the cost of having the deconstruction occur. So I am going to just kind of quickly show you a few pictures. The picture I want to show is this one. So where the materials go. So there's no rule that says where you have to put your materials that have been salvaged from a deconstruction, But if you donate them to the city, we're going to put them to good use. And so we use them for affordable housing projects. You can see here, this is my favorite new picture, where we've introduced old framing with new on a major rehabilitation. And so this reduces the cost of new construction that need to go into that project so that we can use it in other places. And also creates a more environmentally sound project. And then if you don't know anything about old wood, is that it's higher quality. And so those boards are straighter, they're more dense, they're more, absolutely. And so you're getting a higher quality product. Okay, and then to wrap up, education outreach, we always think about, who's going to be Cory when Cory's not here anymore, who's going to be tomorrow's preservationist, who's going to take over the architectural review committee when Ricky's not leading it anymore. And so it's all about outreach and engaging people, and so also who's going to fix all these windows. And so window replacement is a very common request before our commission, and very often they are required by our adopted policy to be repaired versus fully replaced, and so it takes people to do that. And so the more people we have that are trained and locally certified and have knowledge and can do it, the more affordable it becomes, the more timely and easy it is for that to happen. And so we've been doing window trainings for 15 years now to get people certified in that. How do we connect people and build capacity for community participation and advocacy? If there is ever something at the state level that was going to negatively impact our ordinance, I hope that you all would join in and help contact your representatives and oppose those things at the advocacy level. That's not something that we can really do for you. We can provide information that informs those, but you guys are the advocates, not city staff. And then how can we support success? How do we make you all successful in this process? So I've mentioned the Home Repair Fair. We have several other initiatives that you may have seen. Donuts and DIY. We haven't used that branding in a while, but this was just like a Saturday morning kind of hands-on thing like this. I think some of our preservation academies will probably be branded as Donuts and DIY, where we just have donuts and you can come learn how to use a tool and work on a window and learn how to do it yourself. During Preservation Month in the month of May, we have a lot of programming around just like heritage and culture in San Antonio. Here we are at the Home Repair Fair. This is our Historic Districts Coalition volunteers staffing a table and getting people to sign up for the email list and receive updates about when we are meeting and educational opportunities. Amazing Preservation Race, we do this every year. We have one for kids too in Hemisphere. And so this is connecting people that may not normally come downtown, and they get to run to different historic landmarks and do challenges and see things they haven't seen before. Donuts and DIY, here we are. This is Katie, who doesn't work here anymore, but she's leading a class on window reglazing, and so this is something that, if you're handy, you really could probably fix a window a weekend and do them one at a time and save a lot of money doing that. But we want to make sure that you have the skills and know-how and know what tools to get and all of that, and know when to hire a professional when needed. We train realtors. This one's really important. So we hear all the time, I didn't know this house was historic when I bought it. Like, wish I had. So the realtor is a really good resource if they know how to check for designation or know what that means, can communicate what it means to be designated. There are a lot of other places where this is disclosed, just people ignore it sometimes, but this is, we have hundreds of realtors that have come through the certification with the Board of Realtors. The Living Heritage Trades Academy, this is a certified apprenticeship program through SA Works, where we have paid apprentices that get paired with a contractor that we know is skilled in historic preservation. And we go out to Port SA and work on the bungalows we have a lease at, and we repair windows and repair siding and foundation skirting and all of those things. And so those apprentices are not only getting hands-on experience, but they also have a pipeline to work with that contractor if it's a good relationship. Restored by Light is happening Friday, November 7th at Mission San Jose. Don't miss it. This is where we project the historic fresco pattern onto the facade of the church, and it's really fun. There it is. But it's better in person, so. All right, I know I talked for longer than I said I would, but I'm happy to answer any questions.